5-year-old Amy lost her mother during the concert and was crying in tears under the stage. When Elvis saw her, he stopped the concert, and what he did next brought 20,000 people to tears. The Memphis Coliseum on a sweltering summer evening in July 1977 was packed beyond capacity with Elvis Presley fans who had traveled from across the country to see the king of rock and roll perform in his hometown. The venue, which typically held 12,000 people, had been expanded with additional seating to accommodate nearly 20,000 eager fans, creating an atmosphere of electric anticipation that seemed to vibrate through the very structure of the building. Outside the Coliseum, the parking lots were filled with cars bearing license plates from dozens of states, testament to the drawing power of Elvis's performances and the dedication of his fan base. Families had driven for days, spent their savings on tickets, and arranged their entire summer vacations around this single evening of entertainment. For many, attending an Elvis concert was a once-in-a-lifetime experience that they had dreamed about for years. The crowd that evening was notably diverse, spanning multiple generations and backgrounds. Grandparents who had been fans since Elvis's early days sat alongside young children experiencing their first concert, while teenagers and middle-aged adults filled the seats between them. The common thread connecting all these disparate individuals was their shared love for Elvis's music and their excitement at the prospect of seeing him perform live. Among the thousands of fans making their way into the venue that evening were Sarah Mitchell and her 5-year-old daughter Amy, who had traveled from their small town in rural Tennessee specifically for this concert. Sarah, a single mother who worked as a nurse at the local hospital, had saved for months to afford the tickets, viewing them as a special treat for both herself and her daughter, who had inherited her mother's love for Elvis's music. Amy was a precocious child with bright blonde curls and sparkling blue eyes that seemed to take in everything around her with wonder and curiosity. She had been listening to Elvis's records since she was old enough to dance, and her mother often found her singing along to Love Me Tender or Can't Help Falling in Love while playing in her room. For Amy, Elvis wasn't just a singer, he was a magical figure who existed somewhere between reality and fairy tale, and the prospect of seeing him in person filled her with an excitement that she could barely contain. The journey to Memphis had been an adventure in itself for the small family. They had made the 3-hour drive in Sarah's old sedan, stopping at roadside diners and singing Elvis songs together to pass the time. Amy had worn her best dress, a pink sundress with white flowers that her grandmother had made especially for the occasion, and carried a small handmade sign that read "Amy Loves Elvis" in her own careful printing. As they approached the Coliseum, Amy pressed her face against the car window, marveling at the crowds of people and the excitement that seemed to fill the air. She had never seen so many people gathered in one place, and the energy of the crowd was both thrilling and slightly overwhelming for a child who was accustomed to the quiet rhythms of small-town life. The process of entering the venue proved to be more challenging than Sarah had anticipated. The crowds were larger and more boisterous than she had expected, and keeping track of Amy while navigating through the masses of people required constant vigilance. Amy, for her part, was doing her best to stay close to her mother, but her small stature made it difficult for her to see over the adults around her, and the constant jostling of the crowd was disorienting. Once inside the Coliseum, the sensory overload was immediate and intense. The venue was filled with the sounds of thousands of conversations, the bustling of vendors selling souvenirs and refreshments, and the testing of sound equipment on the stage. The lighting was dim in the seating areas but blindingly bright near the stage, creating a dramatic contrast that added to the theatrical atmosphere of the evening. Amy held tightly to her mother's hand as they made their way through the crowded corridors toward their seats. The sheer scale of the venue was intimidating for a small child. The ceilings seemed impossibly high, the crowds appeared endless, and the noise level was unlike anything she had ever experienced. Despite her excitement about seeing Elvis, she found herself feeling slightly anxious about being in such a large and chaotic environment. Their seats were located in the general admission section, relatively close to the stage but requiring them to navigate through several rows of already seated fans to reach their designated spots. Sarah apologized repeatedly as they squeezed past other concertgoers, while Amy tried to make herself as small as possible to avoid stepping on anyone's feet or blocking their view. The wait for the concert to begin felt interminable to Amy, who had little concept of how long such events typically took to start. She fidgeted in her seat, swinging her legs and asking her mother repeatedly when Elvis would appear. Sarah did her best to keep her daughter entertained, pointing out interesting details about the stage setup and the elaborate lighting system that would soon transform the venue into a spectacular show environment. As the minutes turned into an hour, Amy's excitement began to mix with restlessness. The crowds around them grew louder and more animated as showtime approached, and the energy in the venue reached a fever pitch that was both exhilarating and overwhelming. Sarah noticed that Amy was becoming increasingly fidgety and suggested that they take a quick trip to the restroom before the show began. The journey to the restroom proved to be an odyssey in itself. The corridors were packed with people, and the lines for the facilities were extremely long. Amy, who had been drinking soda during their wait, was becoming increasingly urgent about her need for a bathroom break, while Sarah grew more concerned about the possibility of missing the beginning of the show. After what felt like an eternity, they finally made it into the restroom and then began the challenging process of navigating back to their seats. However, the crowd had grown significantly denser during their absence, and the return journey proved to be far more difficult than their original trip to the restroom had been. The corridors were now packed with people who were also trying to return to their seats before the show started, creating a human traffic jam that moved at a frustratingly slow pace. As they made their way through the increasingly dense crowd, Sarah maintained a firm grip on Amy's hand while using her free arm to clear a path through the mass of people. The going was slow and stressful, with both mother and daughter feeling the pressure of trying to return to their seats before Elvis took the stage. The excitement in the air was palpable, but it was now mixed with a sense of urgency that added tension to an already challenging situation. It was during this crowded navigation that disaster struck. As they were squeezing through a particularly dense section of the corridor, a group of excited teenagers pushed past them rather roughly, causing Sarah to lose her balance momentarily. In the confusion and jostling that followed, Amy's small hand slipped from her mother's grasp for just a few seconds. Those few seconds, however, were enough for the crowd to shift and move, creating a gap between mother and daughter that quickly widened as more people filled the space between them. Sarah immediately realized what had happened and began calling Amy's name while pushing against the flow of the crowd to try to reach her, but the mass of people was too dense and was moving with too much momentum for her to make progress against it. Amy, suddenly finding herself alone in a sea of adult legs and bodies, began to panic. The faces around her were all unfamiliar, and her mother's voice seemed to be coming from farther and farther away. She tried to push through the crowd toward where she thought her mother's voice was coming from, but her small size made it impossible for her to make headway against the flow of much larger people. Within minutes, Amy found herself completely separated from her mother and utterly lost in the maze of corridors and crowds that made up the coliseum's interior. The noise level, which had seemed exciting when she was safely with her mother, now felt overwhelming and frightening. Every face she looked up at belonged to a stranger, and none of them seemed to notice her distress or offer to help. Sarah, meanwhile, was becoming increasingly frantic as she realized that Amy was nowhere to be seen. She began asking people around her if they had seen a small blonde girl in a pink dress, but the crowd was too focused on getting to their seats and the approaching show to pay much attention to her pleas for help. The venue's security personnel were stationed at strategic locations, but they were primarily focused on crowd control and preventing unauthorized access to restricted areas, rather than helping reunite separated family members. As the minutes ticked by and the start of the concert approached, both Sarah and Amy were becoming increasingly desperate. Sarah was torn between continuing to search for her daughter and seeking help from venue security, while Amy was growing more and more frightened as she wandered through corridors that all looked the same to her 5-year-old eyes. Lost and alone in the vast coliseum, Amy's panic began to escalate as the reality of her situation set in. The corridors that had seemed exciting and interesting when she was with her mother now appeared endless and confusing, filled with strangers who were all focused on their own concerns and seemingly oblivious to the distress of one small child. Amy's first instinct was to try to find her way back to their seats, but she quickly realized that she had no idea how to navigate the complex layout of the venue. All the corridors looked similar to her, and the seat numbers that were supposed to provide guidance meant nothing to a child who was only just learning to read. The overhead announcements that periodically echoed through the venue were too loud and distorted for her to understand, adding to her sense of confusion and isolation. As she wandered through the crowds, Amy began calling out for her mother, her voice growing more desperate with each unanswered cry. "Mommy! Mommy!" she called, but her small voice was easily drowned out by the ambient noise of thousands of conversations and the sounds of the venue's preparation for the show. Some people noticed her distress and looked down at her with concern, but in the chaos and excitement of the pre-show period, no one took the time to stop and offer substantial help. The longer Amy remained lost, the more frightened she became. The faces around her all belonged to strangers, and the sheer size of the adults surrounding her made her feel smaller and more vulnerable than ever. She had never been separated from her mother in such a large and unfamiliar environment, and her 5-year-old mind struggled to process the overwhelming nature of her situation. Eventually, Amy's wandering brought her to an area near the stage where the crowds were particularly dense and the excitement level was at its peak. The proximity to the performance area meant that the lighting was brighter and the noise level was even higher than in other parts of the venue. For a small child who was already overwhelmed and frightened, this environment was particularly intense and disorienting. It was in this area, pressed against a barrier that separated the general audience from the stage area, that Amy finally succumbed to the full weight of her fear and loneliness. The tears that had been threatening to fall since she first realized she was lost now came in earnest, accompanied by sobs that spoke to the depth of her distress and confusion. Amy pressed herself against the barrier, partly for physical support and partly in the hope that somehow her mother might be able to see her from their seats and come to rescue her. The crowd around her was focused entirely on the stage, where preparations for Elvis's entrance were reaching their climax, and her quiet sobs went largely unnoticed by the excited fans who surrounded her. As the house lights dimmed and the crowd's excitement reached fever pitch, Elvis Presley made his dramatic entrance onto the stage. The roar of approval from 20,000 fans was deafening, creating a wall of sound that seemed to shake the very foundations of the building. Spotlights blazed to life, illuminating Elvis in his iconic white jumpsuit, and the opening notes of his first song filled the venue with the powerful sound that had made him a legend. For the vast majority of the audience, this was the moment they had been waiting for. The culmination of months of anticipation and the beginning of what they hoped would be an unforgettable evening of entertainment. Fans leaped to their feet, screaming and applauding, while cameras flashed throughout the venue as people attempted to capture this magical moment. Elvis began his performance with characteristic energy and charisma, commanding the stage with the presence that had made him one of the most recognizable performers in the world. His voice filled the coliseum with rich, powerful tones that reached every corner of the venue, while his movements and gestures created a visual spectacle that complemented the musical experience perfectly. However, Amy was too overwhelmed by her situation to appreciate the spectacle unfolding before her. The noise level, which had been challenging before, was now almost unbearable for a frightened child, and the flashing lights and movement on stage only added to her sensory overload. She continued to cry quietly against the barrier, hoping desperately that somehow her mother would find her or that someone would help her reunite with the only familiar person in this vast sea of strangers. The irony of the situation was not lost on anyone who might have taken the time to notice it. Here was a small child who had come to see her idol perform, but who was now too distressed to enjoy the very experience that she had been so excited about just hours earlier. The concert that was supposed to be a magical experience had instead become a nightmare of separation and fear. As Elvis moved through his set list, performing hit after hit to the delight of his adoring fans, Amy remained pressed against the barrier near the stage. Her crying had quieted somewhat, partly from exhaustion and partly because she was beginning to realize that her sobs were not attracting the help she needed. Instead, she stood motionless, watching the stage with eyes that were red from crying and a heart that was heavy with loneliness and fear. The positioning of the barrier where Amy had taken refuge meant that she was actually quite close to the stage, much closer than many of the audience members who had paid premium prices for their seats. Under different circumstances, this would have been an incredible vantage point for watching Elvis perform. As it was, Amy was too distressed to fully appreciate her proximity to the performer she had been so excited to see. It was during Elvis's third song that the moment occurred, which would transform the evening from a nightmare into something magical. As Elvis moved across the stage, engaging with different sections of the audience and making eye contact with fans in various parts of the venue, his gaze happened to fall upon the area near the barrier where Amy was standing. What Elvis saw was not just another excited fan, but a small child who was clearly in distress. Even from the stage, he could see that Amy was crying and that she appeared to be alone among the crowd of adults. His performer's instincts, which had been honed over decades of live shows, immediately told him that something was wrong with this particular situation. Elvis had always been known for his connection with his audience and his ability to notice individual faces in even the largest crowds. Throughout his career, he had developed a reputation for stopping mid-song to help fans who were in distress, whether they were feeling faint in the heat of a crowded venue or needed assistance with some other problem. His natural empathy and genuine concern for his fans' well-being had become part of his legend as much as his musical talents. In this case, Elvis's concern was heightened by the fact that the person in distress was a small child who appeared to be lost and alone. As a father himself, Elvis understood the terror that a young child would feel in such a situation, and his protective instincts kicked in immediately. Without hesitation, he made a decision that would surprise the entire audience and create a moment that would be remembered for decades to come. Elvis stopped singing mid-verse and walked to the edge of the stage closest to where Amy was standing. The sudden cessation of music and movement caused a ripple of confusion to spread through the audience, as 20,000 people tried to understand why the performance had suddenly halted. The musicians behind him, equally confused, gradually stopped playing as they realized that something unexpected was happening. "Hold on just a minute, folks," Elvis said into his microphone, his voice carrying clearly through the venue's sound system. "I see a little girl down here who looks like she might need some help." His tone was gentle and concerned, immediately communicating to the audience that this was not part of the planned show, but rather a genuine response to a real situation. The crowd began to quiet down as they realized that Elvis was addressing a specific situation rather than simply taking a planned break in the performance. Many audience members began looking around, trying to spot the child that Elvis was referring to, while others focused their attention on the stage to see how this unexpected development would unfold. Elvis set down his microphone and made his way to the edge of the stage, where he knelt down to bring himself closer to Amy's eye level. The gesture was both practical, making it easier for him to communicate with a small child, and symbolic, showing that he was willing to literally lower himself to help someone in need. "Hey there, sweetheart," Elvis said, his voice now carrying only to those closest to the stage. "What's your name?" His tone was warm and reassuring, the same voice that had comforted millions through his music now being used to comfort one frightened child. Amy looked up at Elvis with wide, tear-filled eyes, initially too overwhelmed to respond. The combination of her distress at being lost and her awe at suddenly finding herself face to face with Elvis Presley left her momentarily speechless. She had dreamed of meeting Elvis, but never under circumstances like these. "It's okay," Elvis continued gently. "You're safe now. Can you tell me your name?" His patience and kindness began to break through Amy's fear and confusion, and she managed to whisper her name in response to his question. "Amy," she said, her voice barely audible even in the sudden quiet that had fallen over the nearby section of the audience. "I can't find my mommy." The simple statement, delivered with the heartbreaking honesty of a frightened child, seemed to touch everyone within hearing distance. Elvis nodded understandingly and reached out his hand toward Amy. "Would you like to come up here with me, Amy? We'll find your mommy together." His offer was made with the same warmth and sincerity that characterized all his interactions with fans, but in this case it carried special significance as a lifeline for a child in distress. Amy hesitated for just a moment, overwhelmed by the surreal nature of her situation. Just minutes before, she had been lost and alone in a crowd of strangers, and now Elvis Presley himself was offering to help her. With the trusting nature of a child, she reached up and allowed Elvis to lift her over the barrier and onto the stage. The moment that Amy was safely in Elvis's arms, the entire atmosphere of the venue shifted. What had been a concert became something much more profound, a demonstration of human kindness and compassion that transcended entertainment and touched the hearts of everyone present. The audience, which had initially been confused by the interruption to the show, now understood that they were witnessing something extraordinary. Once Amy was safely on stage, Elvis carried her to the center of the performance area, where she would be visible to the entire audience. The contrast between the small, frightened child and the larger-than-life performer created a powerful visual that emphasized both Elvis's humanity and his genuine concern for his fans' well-being. "Ladies and gentlemen," Elvis announced into the microphone, his voice carrying to every corner of the venue, "this is Amy, and she's looking for her mommy. I'm sure her mother is somewhere out there in the audience, probably worried sick." His words carried a combination of authority and compassion that immediately focused the attention of all 20,000 audience members on the task of helping reunite mother and daughter. The response from the audience was immediate and overwhelming. People throughout the venue began looking around for a woman who appeared to be searching for a lost child, while others began calling out information about possible matches they had spotted. The concert had been transformed from a passive entertainment experience into an active community effort to solve a problem that everyone could relate to. Amy, still overwhelmed by the situation but now feeling safer in Elvis's protective presence, clung to his hand while looking out at the sea of faces in the audience. The stage lights, which had seemed frightening when she was lost in the crowd, now provided excellent visibility for anyone in the audience who might be looking for her. Elvis knelt down beside Amy and spoke to her in a voice that was amplified by the microphone, but remained gentle and reassuring. "Amy, can you see your mommy anywhere out there?" he asked, giving her time to scan the audience for any sign of her mother. The question was both practical, giving Amy an opportunity to spot her mother if she was visible, and emotional, showing the entire audience that Elvis was treating her as a person worthy of respect and consideration rather than simply as a problem to be solved quickly. The search didn't take long. Somewhere in the middle section of the venue, Sarah Mitchell was already on her feet, waving frantically and calling Amy's name. She had been searching desperately for her daughter throughout the venue and had only just returned to the seating area when she heard Elvis's announcement. The relief and joy on her face were visible even from the stage, and her emotional reaction helped the audience members around her quickly identify her as the mother they were all looking for. "I think I see her," Amy exclaimed, pointing excitedly toward the section where her mother was standing. The moment of recognition was magical. Mother and daughter had found each other across the vast space of the coliseum, connected by love and aided by the kindness of a performer who had been willing to stop his show to help. What happened next created one of the most emotionally powerful moments in concert history. Elvis, still holding Amy's hand, walked to the edge of the stage and gestured toward Sarah's location. "Ma'am, would you like to come down here and get your daughter?" he called out, his voice carrying clearly through the sound system and reaching Sarah despite the distance between them. The audience members around Sarah immediately began helping her make her way toward the stage, creating a path through the crowd and ensuring that she could move quickly and safely toward her daughter. The entire venue had become invested in this reunion, with thousands of people working together to facilitate the moment when mother and daughter would be back together. As Sarah made her way toward the stage, guided by the helpful hands and voices of fellow concertgoers, Amy remained on stage with Elvis, who continued to comfort and reassure her while they waited for her mother to arrive. He asked her about her favorite songs, her hometown, and other gentle questions designed to keep her calm and distracted while the reunion was being arranged. When Sarah finally reached the area near the stage, the emotion of the moment was overwhelming for everyone present. The relief on her face at seeing that Amy was safe, combined with her gratitude toward Elvis for his kindness, created a tableau that spoke to the deepest human values of love, protection, and community. Elvis helped Amy down from the stage and into her mother's waiting arms, creating a moment of pure joy that resonated throughout the entire venue. The embrace between mother and daughter was prolonged and emotional, with both crying tears of relief and happiness, while the audience watched with their own eyes filled with tears. The applause that followed was unlike anything typically heard at a concert. It wasn't applause for a performance or a song, but rather a celebration of human kindness and the successful resolution of a crisis that had touched everyone present. The 20,000 people in attendance were applauding not just Elvis's gesture, but the triumph of compassion over indifference and the power of community to come together in times of need. Elvis remained at the edge of the stage, watching the reunion with obvious satisfaction and pleasure. His decision to stop the concert and help Amy had not only solved an immediate problem, but had created a moment of genuine human connection that elevated the entire evening beyond mere entertainment into something truly meaningful. After the emotional reunion, Elvis invited both Amy and Sarah to remain near the stage for the rest of the concert, ensuring that they would not be separated again and giving them a premium viewing experience as thanks for their patience during the disruption. Sarah, still overcome with gratitude and emotion, could barely find words to thank Elvis for his kindness and for the care he had shown toward her daughter. The concert that followed the reunion was charged with an emotional energy that was different from any typical Elvis performance. The audience, having just witnessed an extraordinary demonstration of human kindness, was more engaged and appreciative than usual. Every song seemed to carry additional meaning. Every gesture from Elvis was met with increased enthusiasm, and the overall atmosphere of the venue was one of celebration and community. For Amy, the remainder of the concert was a magical experience that far exceeded her original expectations. Not only was she able to see Elvis perform from an incredible vantage point, but she had also experienced his kindness and attention in a way that made her feel special and valued. The fear and distress of being lost had been transformed into a story of rescue and care that she would treasure for the rest of her life. The story of Amy's rescue became part of Elvis lore, told and retold by fans who were present that evening, and eventually becoming part of the broader narrative about Elvis's character and his relationship with his audience. It served as evidence of his genuine care for his fans and his willingness to put their needs ahead of his own performance, even in the middle of a major concert. For Sarah, the evening provided not only relief at being reunited with her daughter, but also a profound appreciation for the kindness that still existed in the world. Elvis's gesture had shown her that fame and success didn't have to diminish a person's humanity. and that even in the most public of circumstances, it was possible to take time to care for individuals in need. The impact of that evening extended far beyond the immediate participants. The thousands of audience members who witnessed Elvis's gesture carried the story with them, sharing it with friends and family and using it as an example of how people should treat one another. The concert became famous not just for the music that was performed, but for the demonstration of human values that occurred when the music stopped. In the years that followed, Amy would often tell the story of the night Elvis Presley stopped his concert to help her find her mother. The memory of his kindness, his gentle voice, and his willingness to make her safety a priority over his performance became a defining moment in her childhood and a source of inspiration throughout her life. It taught her that true greatness was measured not by talent or fame, but by how one treated others, especially those who were vulnerable and in need of help.